has been a while since we have done a bread tutorial together, but now that school is back in session, I have enough quiet time to talk with you for a little bit. So I thought today we will make some fresh milled sourdough sandwich bread together. And this is the softest, most mild tasting fresh milled sandwich bread I have ever had. So I'll get into all the details in a minute, but first let's just mill these wheat berries and chat about what I'm using. Anytime that I want to make a really light and mild tasting fresh milled sandwich bread, I like to use a combination of hard white wheat and kamut. Now you could use all hard white wheat, all hard red wheat. It really doesn't matter what you do as long as you're using hard wheat. The reason why I like to combine hard white wheat and kamut when I'm making fresh milled sandwich bread is because it's a nice balance between creating enough gluten structure, but also a mild flavor. So hard white wheat definitely has a more mild flavor than say hard red wheat, but that kamut has an even more mild flavor. So it just creates more of like a white bread flavor, or as close as you could get to that in sandwich bread. But with that said, as long as you're using hard wheat, you are going to be all right. Okay, so the flour is milled, and I want to note that I milled that on the finest setting on my Mockmill. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I am going to mill a little bit of extra flour. So here I have just a cup of hard white wheat berries. And what I'm going to do with this is mill it and set it aside. I'm going to use this to adjust the quality of my dough if necessary. And then any extras I'll just freeze and use later. But I always like to keep a little bit of extra fresh milled flour on hand to adjust the quality of the dough. Because often when you're making bread, the dough can be a little bit sticky and you have to add more flour to it. So it's just helpful to have some ready to go. Okay, so we are ready to make this dough. So I'm simply going to put all of the ingredients, with the exception of the salt for now, right into the bowl of my stand mixer. So we have the hard white wheat and the kamut going right in, and that's kind of nice since I'm working in grams. It's already measured and ready to go. And now I'm going to add some sunflower lecithin and vital wheat gluten. These are polarizing ingredients in the homemade bread world. I'm going to talk a little bit more about these in just a minute. Let's just get the dough mixed up, and then we'll talk about what these do and why some people don't like to use them, but why I have decided to use them. And then I'm going to add 375 grams of water, which is about a cup and a half. When you are working with fresh milled flour, especially if you are using hard wheat, you usually need more water than what you would say for an all-purpose flour or a bread flour. So the hydration of this dough is a little bit higher, but that's because we need more liquid because the flour has all the bran and the germ in it. It absorbs all that water. It's like a thirstier flour, so we just need more water. I just accidentally poured in 383 grams of water. It's a little bit much, but that's an easy fix because we have extra flour milled. So if that dough ends up a little bit too sticky, we can always add a little bit more flour, which I'll show you how to do in a minute. And then I'm going to add 115 grams of sourdough starter. So this sourdough starter I fed last night with all-purpose flour. And sometimes folks on the YouTube and on the internet give me a hard time about that because I'm making fresh milled flour bread. But here's the deal. I just feed my sourdough starter whatever flour I have on hand, which works for me and is totally fine with me. You should feed your sourdough starter whatever flour you want to feed it, and you should use whatever sourdough starter you want for your bread. I'm on a real roll today. Instead of 115 grams, I put in 130. I don't know what my problem is, but all of these things are fine. Sometimes I think we get a little wrapped up in the precision of sourdough, when in reality, it's super flexible and easy to fix. You just need to know how. So once we see what this dough looks like, we'll talk about how we can fix it if we need to. 58 grams of unsalted butter and 30 grams of honey. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is mix this up, and we're going to hold on the salt just for a little bit. Now, I tend to forget the salt sometimes when I add the salt in later, so I recommend putting the salt right by your mixing bowl so that way you remember to add it in a little bit. But what I'm going to do first is mix it with this paddle attachment. So I know a lot of bread recipes often recommend mixing it with your dough hook, which we will do. But I like to start with the paddle attachment because that fresh milled flour has a lot of oil in it. Store-bought flours usually have those oils removed. But because this has oil in it, sometimes it's a little hard for that dough hook to catch the flour and to actually mix it up. So if you use your paddle attachment first and get everything mixed up, after you let it rest for 30 minutes or so, it's a lot easier to knead it with the dough hook. So we'll use this first. Okay, so that is all mixed up, and that only took like 45 seconds or so. And you can see it's fully combined, but it's pretty sticky, right? That almost looks like a batter more than a dough. Right now, at this point, I am not going to worry about it, because that flour needs time to absorb the liquid. When you're working with hard wheat and making bread, it is really important to let that dough autolyse, which is just a period of time where you let the flour absorb the liquid. And then you can start assessing if you need more flour, if you need more water. It is too early to tell right now. Based upon my experience making this recipe, it probably will need more flour, but I wouldn't recommend making any adjustments until you let that dough rest for 30 to 45 minutes. I'm also waiting to add the salt. Now, in all honesty, if you add the salt at this point, it is not going to be the end of the world. You will still have totally great bread, but holding off on the salt can help the gluten development later. So while this rests and absorbs the liquid, the structure of the protein of the gluten is changing, and salt can have an effect on that. So whether or not you add the salt, it's really up to you. But the reason why I like to hold off on the salt, especially when I'm working with fresh milled flour, is because often the complaint I hear the most and what my family talks about the most is that the texture of fresh milled flour isn't always what they want. So I'm always trying to tweak the recipe and the process a little bit just to create a little bit of a lighter and fluffier loaf. All I'm going to do now is cover this with a damp towel and let it sit for about 30 to 45 minutes. While we wait, let's talk about vital wheat gluten and sunflower lecithin. So these are kind of polarizing ingredients in the bread making world because even though they are naturally derived, they are processed ingredients. Vital wheat gluten is almost 100% pure wheat gluten. Adding it to your bread dough increases the total gluten content, which can help increase the elasticity of your dough. What that means, in short, is it creates a stronger, stretchier dough, meaning it can hold more air pockets. Creating a fluffy loaf with fresh milled flour is a little bit tricky sometimes for a few reasons. Because fresh milled flour has the bran and the germ, it creates a heavier dough, which creates just a more dense loaf. That's really normal with fresh milled flour. But also that bran and germ are sharp. So that means while your dough is proofing, it can break some strands of the dough, creating fewer air pockets. So vital wheat gluten then adds strength to your dough, meaning it can hold more air, creating a lighter and fluffier loaf. Sunflower lecithin is a natural emulsifier. So what that means is it binds the water in the fat in the dough to create a softer crumb. One thing I see people talk about a lot when they're making sandwich bread with fresh milled flour is that it falls apart a lot. And sunflower lecithin can really help with that. And on top of that, it retains moisture. Fresh milled flour bread often dries out really quickly, so the sunflower lecithin can help it stay softer and more moist longer. And the other thing sunflower lecithin does that I think is super helpful is it boosts the shelf life. Because it is an emulsifier, it helps the fat stay incorporated in the crumb. If you've made fresh milled flour bread before, you've probably found that if you don't freeze it right away, it molds fast. I mean, sometimes within like a day or two. But by using sunflower lecithin, you can really extend the shelf life of your fresh milled flour bread. Both of these products are derived naturally, but they are processed. So sunflower lecithin is made by cold pressing sunflower seeds, and then the sunflower lecithin itself is extracted from that. Vital wheat gluten is made through a process where basically the wheat is soaked and then the starches are removed, and then what's left is the wheat gluten. And of course, these processes are probably much more complex than what I'm explaining here. It's not so much important about how it's made, but really what's important here is that you know these are not necessarily whole foods. So for that reason, some people don't like to add these ingredients into their bread, and that is totally fine. If you want to make a fresh milled sourdough sandwich bread without these ingredients, I do have a recipe for that over my blog at moonandmagnolia.com that I will link in the description box below. But the reason why I have chosen to add these into my bread is because I really like the way the bread turns out, and my family devours it. So basically, I don't want to make things unless my family's going to eat it, and they will eat this all the time. If you're comparing a store-bought sandwich bread to one that you're making from home with fresh milled flour with these two additives, for sure the clear winner in terms of the quality of ingredients is the one you're making at home, even if it has vital wheat gluten and sunflower lecithin in it. But I really believe that you should only be making the bread that you want to make and that you enjoy eating. It's been about 45 minutes, and this is looking pretty good. So you can see it's still pretty sticky here, but it's not as bad as it was before. It has a little bit of stretch to it. And that's because that flour has now absorbed some of the water. So it's starting to resemble more of a dough than a batter. but my guess is we're probably gonna have to add more flour to this. So first what we'll do is we'll just start kneading it with the dough hook and we'll go from there. I almost forgot the salt. So before we start kneading it, let's add the salt. And I guess the benefit of putting the salt in before you autolyze is then you don't have to worry about forgetting it. It might be a little hard to hear me over the mixer, but you can see here that the dough hook isn't really catching the dough. One little trick here is to add flour until the dough hook catches. So I'm going to add 1 tablespoon of fresh milled flour at a time until the dough catches, and then we will reassess. Sorry if it's a little loud behind me. I have the mixer going back here, but it took just 1 tablespoon of flour for the dough hook to catch the dough. So I'm gonna let this knead for a few minutes and then we'll see what the texture is like. When I'm working with fresh milled flour, I found that it kneads the best if I keep the mixer on the lower side, usually around setting 3 or so on my mixer. Let's look at this dough. So it's looking pretty good, but it is definitely a little bit sticky. But you can see, sorry if it's a little hard to see here, it is starting to get a little more elastic, but the texture, it's still sticking all over my hands. So what we're going for here is the quality of any dough. If you've made bread with any other type of flour, we're looking for a similar texture. We want it to be smooth and elastic and not sticking all over your fingers. I do find that a slightly tacky dough makes a better loaf of bread, but you still don't want to mess with your hands. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue adding 1 tablespoon of fresh milled flour until the dough no longer sticks to my hands. Now, as I mentioned before, usually you want to let your fresh milled flour rest a little bit and absorb some of that liquid. But at this point, I'm really not adding that much flour. In my experience making this recipe, I usually only need like 2 or 3 tablespoons, and over the course of the bulk fermentation and the second proofing, it absorbs that liquid and everything's fine. So after I add 1 tablespoon, I'll let it knead for about a minute or 2, and then I'll add the next one, so that way I can incrementally assess the texture and the quality of the dough. Okay, that was a total of 4 tablespoons of extra flour that I added. It's still a little bit sticky, and I kind of want that because I did add extra fresh milled flour, so I need to leave a little wiggle room for that bran and germ to absorb the water. So you can see it's still kind of sticking to my hands, but I think we're in pretty good shape here. So now all I'm going to do is let this knead until it passes the Windowpane test. So it usually takes like 5 more minutes or so. So we'll look at it and see how it is after a few minutes in the mixer. No sticking. Okay, let's check for the Windowpane test. So we're getting close. Oh, it's looking pretty good. So it's maybe a little hard for you to see here, but you can see there's the little light spaces to here. That's actually pretty good window pane. Oh yeah, look at that. So I think we're in pretty good shape here. So now it is time to bulk ferment this dough. So all I'm going to do now is take this dough, which is feeling really nice by the way, and I'm going to put it in an oiled bowl and let it bulk ferment for a few hours. How long? I'm not really sure. Time is not a good indicator for whether or not your dough has bulk fermented enough, because time really depends on the type of flour you're using, how much starter you're using, the strength of your starter, the temperature of the room. So rather than looking at hours, we're going to just look at the quality of the dough. And what we're looking for in this case is about a 50% rise. But for now, we're going to put this in a bowl, cover it, and let it sit on the counter at room temperature to bulk ferment. I'll probably switch it to my proofing box later, but I do need to slow the process down just a little bit while I go get my daughter from school and get lunch going and stuff like that. So for now, it'll bulk ferment at room temperature, but later we'll probably switch to the proofing box for a warmer environment. This dough has bulk fermented and is ready to go. And I know I said that time isn't the best point of consideration for bulk fermentation, but just for a frame of reference, that bulk fermented for 4 hours and my thermostat says it is 73 degrees in here. This is technically a Pullman loaf, and that's because I'm making it in a Pullman pan. So this is a 13-inch Pullman pan, and it has this lid on it. And what this lid does is it creates steam. So normally when we bake bread in a regular old loaf pan, it's uncovered. And when it's uncovered, it's losing a bunch of moisture. That steam is escaping into the oven. But keeping this lid on the Pullman pan holds the moisture in, which creates a softer loaf of bread. So if you combine that with the high hydration dough, the vital wheat gluten, and the sunflower lecithin, this makes a super soft bread. Now, just for fun trivia night stuff in case you need it, the reason this is called a Pullman pan is because this was the type of loaf pan they used on Pullman train cars. They needed a type of loaf pan and bread that was square and stackable, so this is what they used, so that way they could fit as many loaves of bread as possible on the train. So if that question comes up at trivia night, you're welcome. First thing I'm going to do is just spray this pan down with a little bit of spray avocado oil. You could definitely grease it with butter if that's what works for you, but this is just really convenient. And now I'm just going to turn out this dough and shape it. What I like to do with the Pullman loaf is I like to just take the pan and put it next to the dough so that way I can see how long I'm making the dough, because you want it to, of course, fit in the pan. And anytime you're shaping sourdough like this, it is okay if it deflates a little, but we want to retain as many of those bubbles as we can. So just be gentle with it. So I'm making it just a little bit shorter than the loaf pan. And then what I'm going to do, let me just move things around so you can see it here. I am going to start rolling it, but as I roll, I'm going to tuck and pull it a little bit. So that way I'm creating tension. So then I'm just gonna roll it seam side up so I can pinch it. And then I'm going to take my Pullman pan again and lay it next to my dough, because sometimes it gets a little bit longer as you roll it. And I'm gonna fold those edges over so that way the dough and the pan are the same size. And then just pinch those seams. Then we'll transfer the dough right into the pan. This can be a little bit tricky sometimes with a Pullman loaf because the dough is so long, so just get it in there as best as you can. And then once the dough is in there, I'm just kind of gently pressing it to the sides just to make sure it fills the width of the pan. Now that the dough is shaped and in the pan, it just has to sit in the pan for its second proof. We are looking for this dough to rise all the way to 1 inch to 1/2 inch away from the top. Because what we want is for that dough, when it has that third rise, we want it to reach the top of the pan or at least close to it. So we really want to get a nice big rise with this dough. So I am going to put this in my proofing box just to speed things up here since I'm filming, but you could leave it at room temperature or you could put it in a warm spot in a proofing box, whatever you want. And once it hits that 1 inch to 1/2 inch away from the top of the pan, it's time to bake. I bake this bread at 375 for about 50 minutes. Sometimes it needs to go up to 55 minutes. You should just take the temperature of the bread. It should be around 190 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. But once it's done, you just slide the lid off and then turn it out onto a wire rack to cool and let it come all the way down to room temperature before slicing. Okay, it is late. I had to wait for my daughter to go to bed before I could get back to filming. But as you can see, this turned out to be a really beautiful loaf of sourdough sandwich bread. So let's cut into this and see what it looks like. So this turned out to be a really lovely loaf of bread. You can see a little dip right here. I think that's probably because I let it proof just a little bit too long, but either way, it tastes totally fine. Sometimes that's just a sign that it was maxed out with how much it can rise, but either way, totally fine. So you can see here, there's a nice even crumb. It's a nice even loaf of bread that makes it really great for sandwiches. And looking at this slice, you can see that it's pretty squishy, it's flexible. It's really what you want a slice of sandwich bread to be. A little midnight snack here. It's really good. It's just as soft and tender as a regular old piece of sandwich bread that's made with all-purpose or bread flour, but it does have a little bit of that really delicious, earthy, fresh milk flour taste. Sorry, talking with my mouth full. One thing to keep in mind though is that this is made with whole grain flour. So if you're expecting it to taste just like white sandwich bread, it's not going to have quite that flavor, but it does have the same texture. And I think sometimes the mouthfeel of this bread, because it's made with vital wheat gluten and sunflower lecithin, it almost tricks the brain. So if you have picky eaters in your house who really don't like whole grain bread, this might be a really good option for them because it definitely has that feel and texture of a sandwich bread that has all the nutritional benefits of whole grain. If you want to learn more about making sourdough bread, download my free guide to making and using sourdough starter ebook. It is 30+ pages of how to make a sourdough starter, how to use your starter, and more. That ebook uses all-purpose flour because I wrote it before I started using fresh milled flour, but I also have a full blog post and tutorial about how to make a fresh milled sourdough starter. I'll leave that in the description box below. And you can get this recipe over my blog at moonandmagnolia.com. Thank you so much for stopping by today, and I will see you again next time.